The sky cracked open like it was angry. Thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the ground beneath her bare feet. Her shelter, nothing more than canvas and hope, was tearing apart in the wind. Townsfolk had mocked her, left her with nothing but dirt and doubt. But she didn't run, she didn't scream. She planted her feet in the mud and faced the storm. They called her useless, too small, too fragile to survive the Wild West. But when the storm came, she stood alone, mud on her face, rain tearing through her shelter, until a silent Comanche stepped through the downpour, tied her roof down with one hand, and said just 5 words that would change her life. You listen to the ground. And that was the beginning of everything. Red Bluff, New Mexico, spring, 1878. The wooden door creaked open with a gust of desert wind as Elsie Thorne stepped into the general store. She was barely 4'7", though she often insisted she was half an inch taller. Her boots were scuffed from the rocky trail, her dress patched and sun-faded. Slung across her back was a bundle nearly as large as she was, a hoe with a shortened handle, a folded piece of canvas, and a small sack of corn seed. Inside, the murmurs quieted. A tall woman near the pickle barrels leaned toward a companion and whispered, "She's no bigger than a house cat." "And half as useful," someone else snorted. Elsie didn't flinch. She had long since stopped reacting to words meant to bruise. She walked straight to the counter and placed her items down with care. The seeds, the canvas, the hoe. Mr. Hensley, the storekeeper, peered over his spectacles with a smirk tugging at his whiskered face. "Well, well, if it ain't Miss Thorne. Spring planting, is it?" He picked up the hoe and turned it in his hands. "What's this for?" "Digging graves for field mice." Laughter rippled through the store. Elsie kept her gaze steady. "I'm planting corn on my land." Mr. Hensley chuckled as he weighed her sack. "That rocky patch up north? Even the cactus gave up on it." "Then I'll grow something they don't expect," she said. She counted out every coin she had, down to the last cent. With her chin high and her pride intact, Elsie gathered her things and walked back into the wind. Boots dragging, but resolve unshaken. Behind her, the laughter followed like dust. But she didn't look back. Elsie Thorne had barely stepped off the wooden sidewalk when a shadow moved into her path. Daniel Royce. His hat was tilted low over his brow, boots polished like he thought himself a sheriff. But Elsie knew better. Daniel wasn't law. He was cruelty and polished leather. He came from the Hargrove family, the same wagon train clan that had once taken her in when she was a charity case, then dumped her like extra cargo near the New Mexico border when sickness came and she'd become, in their words, too small to be of use. "Well, well," Daniel drawled, folding his arms as if he had a right to the road. "Look who clawed her way back out of the dirt. Little Elsie Thorne. Didn't we leave you somewhere?" Elsie tried to step past him, but he shifted to block her. "I heard you staked a claim," he went on, his grin widening. "What's the plan, huh? Raising tumbleweeds? Or just hoping the coyotes will raise you first?" "I have work to do," she said evenly. But before she could pass, Daniel snatched the sack from her arms. The hoe clattered to the ground and the sack burst open, scattering corn seeds across the dirt road. "Oops," he smirked. Elsie lunged down, trying to gather her things, but he nudged her aside with the toe of his boot. "This ain't a place for dolls," he sneered. "You'll be dead or married to a drunk outlaw before the first frost." Then the air behind him shifted. A shadow rose from the ridge near the store. Silent, tall, unblinking. Hawk's silent step. He stepped forward without a word, his hair braided with red leather strips, a carved necklace resting against his chest. His presence alone silenced the street. Daniel turned and froze. Hawk stooped down, lifted the scattered hoe with one hand, then carefully gathered the spilled corn back into the torn sack. When he finished, he handed the sack to Elsie, their fingers brushing for just a second. Then, from his belt pouch, he took something, a single eagle feather, bound in leather, and placed it gently at her feet. "The earth," he said in a voice like gravel, "does not care how small you are." And with that, he turned and walked away, quiet as smoke. Back on her claim, the land stretched barren and unwelcoming, all windblown dirt and stubborn stone. There was no house, not even a cabin, just a makeshift lean-to pieced together from warped scrap boards and a torn piece of canvas she'd salvaged from a broken chicken coop. It flapped like a wounded bird in the wind. Elsie Thorne had returned from town with little more than seeds, wire, a rusted hoe, and sheer grit. Her shelter stood at the edge of her 20-acre patch, legal on paper but unforgiving in truth. Each night, the wind screamed through the gaps in the boards like it wanted to rip her apart. She slept curled beneath the only warmth she had left, her mother's patchwork quilt, stitched from old dresses long gone. The quilt smelled of Missouri rain and lavender fields, and the kind of safety that didn't exist out here. It was all that remained of the family fever had taken. "You're little, Elsie," her mother used to say, wrapping that same quilt around her shoulders. "But the wind lifts what it doesn't crush." Now the wind only mocked her. That night the rain came, not in furious sheets, but in a steady, cruel drizzle that found every gap, soaked every scrap of cloth, and chilled her straight through to the bone. Water dripped beside her cot, pooling on the dirt floor. Her hands clenched the quilt so tightly her knuckles whitened. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just held on. By dawn she was soaked, shivering, and hollow-eyed. Stepping outside, the morning cold bit at her skin. Her breath came out in visible puffs as she looked toward the flat stone near her doorway, and stopped. There, sitting on the stone as if left by the wind itself, was a small wooden bird. No longer than her hand, it had been carved with care. Wings partially spread, tail curved as though it caught a breeze. Smooth like river-polished bone. Burned into the base were 3 words: "I saw you." Elsie blinked, breath catching. Her fingers reached for it slowly, reverently. The wood was warm despite the morning chill. She looked toward the ridge, where she always felt eyes but saw nothing. She didn't speak. She simply held the bird to her chest and stepped back inside. 3 days later, the sky turned dark again, darker than before. Thunder rolled across the ridge like warning drums, and the wind returned with a vengeance. Elsie scrambled atop a wooden crate, trying to lash the corner of her tarp tighter before it blew clean off. Her fingers fumbled with the rope, wet and stiff with cold. The crate slipped beneath her boots. She tumbled hard into the mud, breath knocked from her chest. As she gasped and looked up, a figure moved through the rain, quiet, solid, like a spirit summoned by need alone. It was him, Hawk Silentstep. He walked through the storm like he belonged to it, soaked but unshaken, a shadow made flesh. Without a word, he stepped past her, reached up, and grabbed the flapping tarp with one hand. In a single motion, he anchored it with rope from his own pack, then braced the back wall with stacked wood, like he'd done it 100 times before. Elsie rose slowly, clutching her arm. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely audible through the rain. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to face her, eyes dark and still as riverstone. "You listen to the ground," he said at last, voice deep and calm. "You do not fight it. That is worth keeping." The words settled into her like warmth in the cold. She blinked. "You carved the bird?" He nodded once. "It is called Tiquata, the sparrow. Small, but it sings before the storm ends." Elsie stared at him, the meaning settling slowly. Not just a carving, a message. She stepped into her lean-to and returned with her canteen, holding it out with 2 hands. He hesitated, then took a single, measured sip. He handed it back with a nod. "I am called Hawk Silentstep," he said. She offered her name in return, quietly. "Elsie." He nodded again, then turned to go. But before he vanished into the downpour, he paused and said, "Build your roots deep, Elsie Sparrow, so they do not wash away." Then he was gone, vanishing into mist and rain, like he had never been there. But the storm no longer felt like an enemy. It had brought something with it, perhaps a beginning. By the end of the week, the wind had calmed, but the quiet between Elsie and Hawk had grown into something else. Not distance, but something unspoken, understood. That morning, they worked together along the low fence Elsie had started, symbolic more than sturdy. She pounded stakes into the ground while Hawk trimmed pine rails with a hatchet that gleamed in the sun. They moved without needing many words, their rhythm steady, natural. Later, under the sparse shade of a cottonwood, Elsie sat on a low stump, sipping from her canteen. Hawk crouched nearby, sharpening his blade with a flat river stone. The air between them felt heavy with more than heat. "I was taken once," he said suddenly. Elsie blinked. "Taken?" He nodded, his voice low and steady. "To a mission school, far south. They cut my hair, gave me a number instead of a name, said my tongue was wrong, my gods were wrong, my ways didn't belong." She stared, stunned. "How old?" "10 summers," he said quietly. "I stayed 2 years. Then I escaped. Walked 4 days through the snow to find my people again." Elsie sat very still, hands resting on her knees. "That must have been terrifying." He shrugged. "It was cold." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cottonwood leaves whispered above. Then Elsie said softly, "I never went to school. Not really. My father taught me to read before he died. After that, it was just work and books." She hesitated, then added, "Most folks looked at me and decided I was too small. Not strong enough for farming, not pretty enough for marriage. Just, not enough." Hawk didn't hesitate. "You are not a waste," he said, his voice firm and clear. She looked away, eyes stinging. "Sometimes I believe them." He stood, walked to his pack, and pulled something from inside. A small hand-carved steak. Its tip was sharp, its wood polished smooth. He offered it to her wordlessly. She took it, her fingers brushing his again. It wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder. She was seen. She was worth something. And for the first time in years, Elsie Thorne believed it might be true. The sun hung low over Red Bluff as Elsie and Hawk stood side by side, surveying the land she had begun to tame. An uneven garden patch, a leaning fence, and a lean-to that looked ready to collapse with the next strong breeze. Hawk's eyes traced the crooked roofline of the shelter, then lifted toward the ridge where tall pines lined the horizon like silent sentinels. "This will not last winter," he said plainly. Elsie swallowed. The truth of it settled like a stone in her stomach. "I know," she murmured. Then he turned to her, his voice steady but gentle. "Let me build you a cabin." She blinked. "A cabin?" He nodded, gesturing toward the ridge. "There is strong pine, straight trunks. I can bring it down, lay beams, raise walls that don't flap in the wind, a roof that holds heat, a fire that stays." Elsie stared at him. No one had ever offered her anything close to that before. Her life had been spent patching together scraps, surviving one day at a time. A real cabin? It sounded like something meant for someone else, someone bigger, worthier. "You want to build that for me?" she asked, her voice quiet with disbelief. "For you to survive," he said. "For you to rest." She looked away, blinking against something that wasn't quite tears. Then finally she nodded. "All right." By the following morning, Hawk had begun hauling logs down from the ridge. He worked with relentless focus, stripping bark, cutting lengths, laying the first beams as the structure began to take shape. But word traveled fast in Red Bluff. By the end of the week, townsfolk were talking. From the saloon porch to the church steps, whispers bloomed like weeds. "She's building with a Comanche. Does she even know who he really is? What's he after anyway?" Elsie heard it all but said nothing. She kept working, hauling water, preparing meals, helping wherever she could. Let them talk, she thought, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just enduring. She was building something that might finally last. It started with a scrap of burlap nailed to the side of her lean-to. Scrawled in charcoal, the words read, "No white girl who lays with savages is welcome." Elsie stood in the morning chill, staring at it with clenched fists. Her breath came out in visible clouds, not from the cold, but from the rage blooming behind her ribs. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She tore the burlap down and tossed it into the fire. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, 6 riders crested the ridge above her plot, hooves kicking up dust in the early light. Sheriff Clay Tarot led them, mustache stiff, badge gleaming. Behind him rode the Royce brothers, Daniel included, flanked by 3 others with hard eyes and tighter mouths. Hawk was outside, splitting logs with calm rhythm when the riders approached. He paused as they dismounted, his axe still in hand, held low. "Miss Thorne," the sheriff called, stopping 10 paces from the unfinished cabin. "You know this man?" Elsie stepped out from under the canvas flap, muddy boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "I do," she said evenly. "His name is Hawk Silentstep. He's building this cabin, with my permission, on my land." A murmur passed through the men. Sheriff Taro's brow furrowed. "Well, we've had a report," he said slowly, "that 4 horses were stolen from Jenkins' ranch last week. A man matching his description was seen near the southern fence line." "You got any proof he took them?" Elsie asked sharply. Taro shifted. "Do you? Do you have any proof he didn't just exist near them?" She fired back. "Or is it enough that his skin's darker and his boots aren't yours?" Daniel Royce spat in the dirt. "He don't belong here." Before tempers could flare further, another rider approached from the trail, this one in a fine riding coat, her silver hair tucked neatly under a wide-brimmed hat. Ruth Ashford, the widow of Red Bluff's founder, a woman whose voice could stir a courtroom or shut a church to silence. She dismounted with grace and held up a folded paper. "Sheriff," she said coolly, "Jenkins Ranch recovered all 4 horses this morning. Wandered back half-starved, tangled in broken fencing. I've confirmed it myself." The tension in the air snapped like dry twine. Taro blinked. "You're certain?" "As certain," Ruth said, locking eyes with Elsie, "as I was when your mother handed me her wedding ring and said, 'Trust the girl who stands alone.'" Sheriff Taro gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Well then," he muttered, turning to his men, "looks like we'll be on our way." As the riders left, Hawk said nothing. He didn't need to. Elsie stood a little taller, and the town of Red Bluff, whether they liked it or not, had just witnessed a woman defend a warrior. And win. It started with a scrap of burlap nailed to the side of her lean-to. Scrawled in charcoal, the words read, "No white girl who lays with savages is welcome." Elsie stood in the morning chill, staring at it with clenched fists. Her breath came out in visible clouds, not from the cold, but from the rage blooming behind her ribs. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She tore the burlap down and tossed it into the fire. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, 6 riders crested the ridge above her plot, hooves kicking up dust in the early light. Sheriff Clay Taro led them, mustache stiff, badge gleaming. Behind him rode the Royce brothers, Daniel included, flanked by 3 others with hard eyes and tighter mouths. Hawk was outside, splitting logs with calm rhythm when the riders approached. He paused as they dismounted, his axe still in hand, held low. "Miss Thorne," the sheriff called, stopping 10 paces from the unfinished cabin. "You know this man?" Elsie stepped out from under the canvas flap, muddy boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. "I do," she said evenly. "His name is Hawk Silentstep. He's building this cabin, with my permission, on my land." A murmur passed through the men. Sheriff Taro's brow furrowed. "Well, we've had a report," he said slowly, "that 4 horses were stolen from Jenkins' ranch last week. A man matching his description was seen near the southern fence line." "You got any proof he took them?" Elsie asked sharply. Taro shifted. "Do you? Do you have any proof he didn't just exist near them?" She fired back. "Or is it enough that his skin's darker and his boots aren't yours?" Daniel Royce spat in the dirt. "He don't belong here." Before tempers could flare further, another rider approached from the trail, this one in a fine riding coat, her silver hair tucked neatly under a wide-brimmed hat. Ruth Ashford, the widow of Red Bluff's founder, a woman whose voice could stir a courtroom or shut a church to silence. She dismounted with grace and held up a folded paper. "Sheriff," she said coolly, "Jenkins Ranch recovered all 4 horses this morning. Wandered back half-starved, tangled in broken fencing. I've confirmed it myself." The tension in the air snapped like dry twine. Taro blinked. "You're certain?" "As certain," Ruth said, locking eyes with Elsie, "as I was when your mother handed me her wedding ring and said, 'Trust the girl who stands alone.'" Sheriff Taro gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Well then," he muttered, turning to his men, "looks like we'll be on our way." As the riders left, Hawk said nothing. He didn't need to. Elsie stood a little taller, and the town of Red Bluff, whether they liked it or not, had just witnessed a woman defend a warrior and win. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting golden light across the half-finished cabin, Hawk stood before Elsie with something wrapped gently in a piece of worn cloth. "For you," he said simply. She unfolded the cloth to reveal a silver bracelet, old and beautiful, with a smooth turquoise stone set into its center. Tiny symbols were etched along its edges, marks she didn't understand but felt drawn to. "It belonged to my mother's line," Hawk said softly. "We pass it to those we trust." Elsie looked up, heart pounding. "I leave for the council," he continued, "but if you still wear it after 7 days, I will return, and we begin again." Elsie didn't speak right away. Her fingers traced the cool metal, her chest tight with emotion. Then slowly, she slipped it onto her wrist. "I'll wear it," she said, voice quiet but certain. Hawk dipped his head once, the firelight catching in his dark eyes. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode into the dusk, his silhouette fading into the trees. The bracelet gleamed on her wrist like a promise sealed in silver and stone. And for the first time, she hoped. On the 7th morning, just as promised, Hawk returned. Elsie stood on the porch of the nearly completed cabin, the silver bracelet still glinting on her wrist. Her breath caught when she saw him approaching, calm and steady, horseback against the rising sun. He dismounted in silence, stepped forward, and gently painted 2 lines on her cheek, one red, one black. Red clay for life, black soot for protection. Then he did the same to himself. They exchanged necklaces, braided from sinew and carved bone, a symbol of spirit and endurance. Together they walked down the path into Red Bluff. The town quieted as they arrived. Boots stopped mid-step, conversations trailed off, and curious eyes turned. Elsie felt her heart race, not from fear but from something bigger, something right. Inside the small chapel, the priest adjusted his spectacles and frowned. "I cannot officiate this," he said flatly. "It is not traditional. It would bring scandal." Elsie didn't argue. She bowed politely and turned away. Outside, Ruth Ashford stood waiting, hands folded over a leather-bound book. "I've seen more truth in you two than I've ever seen behind those stained glass windows," she said with a small smile. "You've earned this." Under the open sky, in front of townsfolk both skeptical and softened, Ruth led the ceremony. She spoke not of doctrine, but of courage, of land, and of love born from shared struggle. Hawk offered his vow in his native tongue, eyes steady, voice low. Elsie didn't understand every word, but she felt every beat of it in her bones. When it was her turn, she smiled through quiet tears. "I may not be strong or tall, or what this land calls practical, but I will stand with you," Hawk silent step. "Every sunrise we're given." Ruth raised their joined hands. "By the covenant of truth, bravery, and love," she declared, "I pronounce you bound, not by law, but by choice." The townsfolk, silent at first, began to clap, slowly, then steadily. Some cheered, some nodded with quiet respect. But Elsie only saw one man, and Hawk only saw one woman. And under the vast blue sky, they were finally home. Dusk settled gently over Red Bluff, casting long, golden shadows across the porch of the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the stove. The scent of pine logs and simmering stew mingled with the cool breath of night drifting in through the open window. Elsie sat beside Hawk on the wooden bench they'd built together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, the silver bracelet still shining faintly on her wrist. They didn't speak for a while, they didn't need to. Outside, the world whispered. Inside, their silence was full. At last, Elsie broke it with a soft voice. "People will talk." Hawk didn't hesitate. He glanced at her, a quiet strength in his gaze. "Let them talk," he said. "We chose each other." She smiled, leaning closer, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath. No walls of doubt could shake what they'd built. Not now, not here. Because this was more than shelter. It was belonging. It was peace carved from storms, love born of endurance. In a world that had once told her she was too small to matter, she had found a place where she was more than enough. Not every frontier is made of dust and pine. Today it might be a hospital room, a quiet kitchen table, or simply waking up to face another day alone. But the lesson is the same. Strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up, quiet, steady, unshaken. Elsie and Hawk reminded us that love isn't about grandeur. It's about choosing someone again and again, Even when the world says you shouldn't, they built something real from broken pieces and open hearts. And maybe that's a lesson we all need right now. In a world that often values size, volume, and appearances, this story reminds us to listen for the quiet ones, the overlooked, the small but stubborn spirits who, like Elsie, keep showing up anyway. What did this story stir in you? Did it remind you of someone you knew or someone you lost? Do you believe love like this still exists in today's world? Or have we forgotten how to build with both hands and heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for walking with us through another tale of the Old West, where the values never left and the echoes still speak. If this story meant something to you, consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to The West That Never Left. Because here we believe that even in silence, the spirit of the West lives on, and sometimes it still chooses you.